Amina had always led a simple life. She was a woman who enjoyed the little things, waking up early to prepare breakfast for her family, taking care of her home, and spending time with her children. She was not one for attention or drama. Amina found joy in the quiet moments with her husband, Zaid, and their two young children. They lived in a small town where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at a steady, predictable pace. But one morning, everything changed. Amina woke up to the sound of loud knocks at her front door. When she opened it, she was greeted by two police officers. They explained that she was being arrested for a crime she knew she had not committed. Shocked, confused, and scared, Amina couldn't understand what was happening. They handed her an arrest warrant, and despite her protests of innocence, they insisted she come with them. She tried to call her husband, but he was away on an official trip. With her heart pounding, Amina followed the officers, her mind racing. The accusations were absurd. She was being charged with a theft that had taken place at the local bank. But Amina had never even been near the bank that day. The small town quickly buzzed with the news of her arrest. Amina's friends and neighbors were stunned. She had always been known as a kind and responsible woman. The idea of her committing such a crime seemed impossible to them. But despite their disbelief, the news spread quickly, and rumors began to swirl. Some people whispered about her arrest in hushed voices, while others discussed it openly. She must have done something wrong, they said. No one gets arrested for no reason. Amina's thoughts were filled with confusion and fear. How could this be happening to her? She couldn't understand why anyone would accuse her of such a thing. Her entire life had been centered around her family and her community. She had always done the right thing. Why would someone frame her like this? The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the trial continued. Amina sat in her chair, her heart pounding in her chest. It felt as if the walls were closing in around her. She had never imagined that her life would come to this, but now, every day in the courtroom felt like a battle for her freedom, for her future. The weight of the accusations, the overwhelming sense of helplessness, and the cold eyes of Judge Malik were beginning to chip away at her resolve. But today was different. Zaid, her husband, had arrived. His presence in the courtroom made all the difference. He was a Supreme Court justice, a man who was known for his unwavering sense of justice and his calm demeanor. He was someone who could move mountains, someone whose words carried weight in the legal world. Amina had always admired him for his integrity, but today, as he walked into the courtroom beside her, she saw him in a new light. He wasn't just her husband, he was her savior. The days following Zaid's intervention in the trial were a whirlwind of activity. Amina had always been a woman who appreciated the calmness of her everyday life, but now, everything was moving faster than she could have ever imagined. The atmosphere in the courtroom had completely shifted. There was a newfound sense of tension, but also a sense of hope, that hadn't been there before. As the trial continued, the prosecution's case, which had once seemed so airtight, now seemed to be unraveling at the edges. Zaid's calm and precise approach to the evidence had exposed the many flaws in their arguments. Every piece of testimony that once appeared to be solid was now being questioned and challenged. Witnesses who had been so sure of their statements were now faltering under Zaid's sharp questioning. His ability to ask the right questions, to find the smallest inconsistencies in their stories, was having a profound effect on the trial. Amina couldn't help but watch in awe as Zaid navigated the courtroom. He was focused, calm, and determined. His quiet confidence had become a pillar of strength for her, giving her the courage to stand tall when everything seemed stacked against her. She knew that he wasn't just fighting for her, he was fighting for the truth. And now, with every passing day, the truth was slowly emerging from the shadows. On the fourth day of the trial, something remarkable happened. Zaid had managed to secure a key piece of evidence, a set of documents that had been overlooked by the prosecution. The documents were related to the bank's internal procedures, showing that the bank's security systems had failed the day of the alleged theft. This new evidence shifted the focus of the trial entirely. Zaid presented it to the court, and for the first time, the prosecutor was left speechless. The documents clearly showed that the bank had failed to follow its own security protocols, and the footage that had been used to implicate Amina was even more questionable than anyone had realized. Zaid stood in front of the judge, his voice steady as he explained the significance of the new evidence. "Your Honor," he said, "this evidence clearly shows that the security system at the bank was inadequate. It is now evident that the surveillance footage cannot be relied upon to identify the suspect. The lack of proper security measures raises doubts about the validity of the prosecution's case." Judge Malik, who had been sitting quietly throughout the proceedings, looked over the documents with a thoughtful expression. Amina could see the change in his demeanor. His earlier bias seemed to be slipping away, replaced by an air of careful consideration. The room was silent as the judge reviewed the evidence. Amina held her breath, hoping that the truth would finally come to light. The prosecutor, Mr. Aslam, looked flustered. He had not anticipated this new development. He quickly stood up to object, but Zaid was ready. "Objection overruled," the judge said, surprising everyone in the room. The prosecutor had no choice but to sit back down, his confidence shattered. Amina felt a wave of relief wash over her. For the first time since the trial had begun, she felt like she might actually be able to walk away from this with her head held high. Zaid had done it. He had found the truth, and now the evidence was in her favor. The next few days were crucial. The defense continued to present evidence, while the prosecution scrambled to counteract the new findings. The courtroom felt like a battlefield, with both sides fighting tooth and nail for a verdict. But Amina knew that the tide was turning in her favor. The more Zaid spoke, the more she felt her own confidence returning. With each question he asked, each document he presented, the case against her seemed to dissolve a little more. On the final day of the trial, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. The jury had been deliberating for hours, and everyone in the room was waiting for their verdict. Amina sat in her seat, her hands clasped together tightly. She had tried to stay calm, but her mind was racing. What would the jury decide? Had Zaid's strategy been enough to convince them of her innocence? The clock ticked on, and every second felt like an eternity. Amina looked at Zaid, who sat next to her, his expression unreadable. He had done everything he could, and now it was out of their hands. The trial had been long, and the road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, Amina allowed herself to feel a sense of peace. She trusted Zaid, and she trusted that the truth would come out. Finally, after what felt like an age, the jury returned. The room went silent as the foreman of the jury stood up. The tension was unbearable. Amina held her breath as the foreman began to speak. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Amina Khan, not guilty of all charges." The words echoed in the room, and for a moment, Amina couldn't believe what she had just heard. Not guilty. She felt like she had just been released from a heavy, suffocating weight. She could hardly believe it, but when she looked around the courtroom, she saw the relief and shock in the faces of everyone there. Zaid smiled at her, his eyes filled with pride and support. Amina's knees went weak, and she felt tears begin to form in her eyes. She had won. She was free. The truth had prevailed. The courtroom erupted into murmurs of disbelief and relief. The prosecutor, who had been so confident just days ago, looked defeated. Judge Malik, though still composed, seemed to acknowledge the shift in the case with a nod of his head. For Amina, it was as though the world had come back into focus. The nightmare she had lived through for so long was finally over. As she stood up, Zaid reached out and took her hand, pulling her into a gentle embrace. She could feel his warmth, his strength, and his support. "You did it," he whispered in her ear. Tears rolled down Amina's cheeks as she clung to him. She had never felt so grateful, so relieved in her entire life. For weeks, she had been consumed by fear and doubt, but now, all of that was behind her. She had survived the worst, and she had done it with Zaid by her side. Later that day, Amina walked out of the courthouse, a free woman. She could finally go home to her children, to the life she had always known. But as she walked with Zaid, she knew that this experience had changed her forever. She had faced the darkest moments of her life and had come out stronger on the other side. The truth had triumphed, and justice had been served. Zaid had been working tirelessly behind the scenes since he had received her call. He had made calls to influential people, digging into the case and gathering information. He had already begun putting the pieces together, and he was ready to use his influence to bring the truth to light. Amina felt a sense of relief wash over her. She was no longer alone in this fight. Zaid was there, and he was determined to help her. As the trial began that morning, Zaid's arrival did not go unnoticed. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The air seemed to crackle with tension as Zaid took his seat beside Amina. The prosecutor, Mr. Aslam, glanced briefly at Zaid, but quickly returned to his case. It was clear that he wasn't intimidated by Zaid's presence, but Amina could sense that things were about to change. The trial proceeded as usual, with the prosecution continuing to present its case. But today, something was different. Zaid was sitting there, listening intently to every word, taking notes and making observations. His calm and collected demeanor contrasted sharply with the anxiety that had gripped Amina for weeks. For the first time in a long time, Amina felt a spark of hope. Zaid was no longer just a bystander. He was actively involved in the process. He was asking questions, raising objections, and carefully studying the evidence. With each passing moment, Amina felt a sense of relief. Zaid was doing exactly what she had hoped he would do. He was taking control of the situation. As the day went on, Zaid's presence began to change the tone of the trial. He was no longer a quiet observer, he was a force to be reckoned with. He stood up when necessary, challenging the evidence and questioning the witnesses. His questions were sharp, precise, and aimed at exposing the holes in the prosecution's case. One of the key moments came when Zaid cross-examined Mr. Iqbal, the bank manager who had accused Amina of being involved in the theft. Zaid's questions were methodical, each one designed to poke holes in the witness's testimony. He asked Mr. Iqbal about the security footage that had been presented as evidence. The footage, though blurry, had been a central piece of the prosecution's argument. The prosecution had claimed that the woman in the footage resembled Amina, but Zaid immediately pointed out the flaws in the footage. Mr. Iqbal, Zaid began, his voice calm but commanding, "You've stated that the woman in the footage is indeed Mrs. Khan, but you must be aware that the image is far from clear. It's grainy, and there is no definitive way to confirm the identity of the person in that footage. Do you really believe that such blurry footage should be the sole basis for this accusation?" Mr. Iqbal hesitated, his confidence wavering. "Well, I don't know," but Zaid pressed on. "Do you have any concrete proof that this woman is, in fact, Mrs. Khan? Any clearer footage? Any identification by other witnesses?" The bank manager stammered, his composure faltering. "No, but then," Zaid continued, "how can we rely on such weak evidence to accuse an innocent woman? The prosecution has nothing but assumptions and speculation." The room fell silent. Zaid's words had struck a blow to the prosecution's case. Amina could see the shift in the courtroom. The jury, who had been listening with mixed emotions, now seemed more attentive, more focused on the flaws in the case against her. Even Judge Malik seemed to take notice. He didn't speak, but Amina could sense the change in his demeanor. He was no longer as dismissive of the defense. After the cross-examination, Zaid sat down, his expression calm but determined. Amina looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. He had taken charge of the situation in a way that she had never been able to do. He had brought logic and reason to the courtroom, and for the first time, the prosecution's case seemed fragile. Amina knew that this was the turning point. With Zaid by her side, she had a chance to prove her innocence. But Zaid wasn't done yet. He wasn't just challenging the witnesses, he was also focusing on the judge. The more Amina thought about it, the more she realized how biased Judge Malik had been throughout the trial. His cold treatment of her, his dismissive attitude toward the defense, and his apparent favoritism toward the prosecution had all been signs that he wasn't impartial. Zaid had noticed it too. During a break in the proceedings, Zaid spoke with the judge privately. Amina couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see the seriousness in Zaid's expression. After a few minutes, Zaid returned to his seat, his face calm, but there was a glint of something in his eyes. Amina couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at how Zaid handled the situation. He had a way of commanding respect without raising his voice, without making threats. He was simply calm, rational, and firm. The trial continued, and as the day went on, Zaid's influence became more apparent. He wasn't just pointing out flaws in the prosecution's case, he was also preparing to present new evidence. Amina had never seen her husband work so tirelessly. He was pulling every string, using every connection he had, and leaving no stone unturned. By the end of the day, it was clear that the tide was turning. The prosecution's case was no longer as solid as it had once seemed. The witnesses were faltering under Zaid's cross-examination, and the evidence that had once seemed so damning was now being called into question. Even Judge Malik, who had once seemed so certain, now appeared to be less confident. As the trial adjourned for the day, Amina felt a sense of relief she hadn't felt in weeks. She knew that the battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had a fighting chance. Zaid had taken control of the situation, and he was doing everything in his power to make sure that the truth came out. When they left the courtroom that day, Amina looked at Zaid with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. Zaid smiled, his expression gentle. "You don't have to thank me, Amina. This is what we do for each other. We fight for the truth, no matter what." Amina felt a sense of peace that she hadn't experienced in a long time. With Zaid by her side, she knew that no matter what happened, she would never stop fighting for her innocence. The local judge, Judge Malik, was the one overseeing her case. Amina didn't know him well, but she had heard things. Judge Malik had a reputation for being strict, but more than that, he had a history of making decisions that seemed a little too harsh for her taste. She had heard whispers that he had personal issues with people in the town, though no one knew for sure. But when it came to Amina, there seemed to be something more. The way the judge had treated her case felt off from the very beginning. She hadn't even been allowed a proper chance to explain herself. It was as if the decision had already been made before she had even stepped foot in his courtroom. The trial had begun, and Amina was caught in the whirlwind of the courtroom. The room felt cold and foreign to her, like she didn't belong there. She had never imagined that one day, she would find herself in a place so filled with tension, where every word could determine her fate. The judge, Malik, was seated at the front, his eyes cold and unyielding as he looked down at her. His stern demeanor made Amina feel small, as if she were already guilty, even before the trial had truly begun. The weight of the trial was taking its toll on Amina. She had never imagined that life could be so difficult. Every day, she felt more trapped, more desperate for a way out. As the trial dragged on, she began to wonder if there was even any hope left. The courtroom had become a place where she no longer felt like herself. It was as if she were living someone else's nightmare. For the past few days, Amina had been silently fighting the overwhelming fear and anxiety that had taken hold of her. She was trying her best to stay strong, to keep her emotions in check. But as she sat in the courtroom, the realization hit her more powerfully than ever before. The judge, Malik, wasn't just being harsh. He seemed to have already made up his mind. Every decision, every comment, felt like it was leading her toward a guilty verdict. The evidence, despite its obvious flaws, seemed to weigh more heavily than her truth. Farhan, her defense lawyer, had been doing his best, but he was struggling. It was clear that he was in over his head. He had prepared the best defense he could, pointing out the lack of solid evidence, but the prosecution's case was much more persuasive. Every time he tried to make a counterargument, Judge Malik would dismiss it with a cold, impersonal glance. Amina began to feel like a pawn in a game she couldn't control, and the fear of losing everything began to grow. One afternoon, during a short break in the trial, Amina found herself wandering alone in the courthouse. She needed a moment to breathe, to clear her head. As she stepped outside, the cool air hit her face, and she closed her eyes, trying to calm the storm inside her. She could hear the distant sounds of the city cars honking, people talking, but it all seemed so distant, like she was in a bubble, separate from the world she once knew. She pulled out her phone, glancing at it as she walked. Her mind immediately went to Zaid, her husband. He had always been her rock, her strength. But now, she felt a deep sense of guilt for not reaching out to him sooner. She had wanted to handle everything herself, to protect him from this mess. But now, she understood that there was no way she could fight this battle alone. With a deep breath, she called Zaid's number. Her heart raced as the phone rang. Would he be angry with her for not telling him sooner? Would he think she had been trying to protect him from the truth? Amina wasn't sure, but she knew one thing: she needed him now more than ever. Zaid answered after a few rings, and his calm voice immediately put Amina at ease. "Amina? What's going on?" he asked, his tone concerned. Amina's throat tightened, and she struggled to find the words. It had been so difficult to keep everything inside, to pretend like she wasn't drowning in her own fear. But now, with Zaid on the other end of the line, she couldn't hold back anymore. She explained everything: the trial, the evidence, the biased judge, the feeling of being completely helpless. Her voice cracked as she spoke, and she could feel the tears welling up in her eyes. She was afraid, more afraid than she had ever been in her life. "I don't know what to do, Zaid," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like I'm losing everything. The judge is already treating me like I'm guilty, and Farhan, he's doing his best, but it's just not enough." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Amina's heart sank. Had she said too much? Was Zaid disappointed in her? But then she heard him speak again, his voice calm and firm. "I'm coming home, Amina," he said. "I'll be there as soon as I can." Relief flooded Amina's chest. She had known, deep down, that Zaid would be there for her. She had known that no matter what happened, he would always stand by her side. But hearing him say those words, knowing that he was going to fight for her, this was the moment when Amina finally allowed herself to believe that there might still be hope. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Zaid was coming. He was going to help her, and together, they would find a way out of this nightmare. She didn't know exactly how he would do it, but she trusted him. He had always been a man of integrity, someone who believed in justice. If anyone could fix this, it was Zaid. The days that followed were a blur of emotions. Amina tried her best to continue attending the trial, but her heart wasn't in it. She felt as though she was just going through the motions, her mind always on Zaid's return. Every time she stepped into the courtroom, she could feel the eyes of the judge on her, cold and judgmental. But now, she didn't care. She had made her decision. She had called Zaid, and he was coming to help. When Zaid finally returned, it felt like a weight had been lifted from Amina's heart. He was calm, focused, and determined to make things right. He had already started looking into the case, reaching out to the right people in the legal system to get the truth uncovered. It was clear that Zaid had the power to move mountains, but even more important, he had the will to do so. Zaid wasn't the type of person who would let anything slide. He believed in fairness, in doing what was right, and in ensuring that justice was served. He began making phone calls, pulling strings behind the scenes. He spoke to colleagues in high places, making sure that the case was reviewed with the utmost seriousness. He was determined to expose the truth, no matter how many obstacles stood in his way. Meanwhile, Amina's mind was constantly filled with worry. She knew that Zaid was working hard to help her, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. What if things didn't go as planned? What if the judge refused to listen, or worse, what if Zaid's involvement made things worse for her? She tried not to let her fears consume her, but it was hard not to think of the worst-case scenarios. The trial was scheduled to continue the next morning, and Amina knew that this would be the turning point. She couldn't afford to wait any longer. She had to trust Zaid, and she had to trust that justice would prevail. The following day, Amina walked into the courtroom with a renewed sense of determination. Zaid's presence, his unwavering support, gave her the strength she needed. She didn't know how the trial would end, but she knew that no matter what happened, she would no longer face it alone. With Zaid by her side, she was ready to fight for the truth, and she would not back down until her innocence was proven. Amina's defense lawyer, Farhan, sat beside her, looking increasingly anxious. He was new to his profession, and though he had a kind heart, his lack of experience was clear. His hands trembled slightly as he shuffled through his notes. Amina could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He had taken on her case with hope, but as the trial dragged on, she could tell that he was beginning to doubt whether they could win. He was doing his best, but the odds felt overwhelmingly against them. The prosecution, led by an experienced lawyer named Mr. Aslam, was ruthless. His voice echoed through the courtroom as he presented the case against Amina, painting a picture of her as a criminal who had carefully planned and executed the theft. His arguments were sharp, and his accusations were swift. Every time he spoke, Amina's heart sank. He presented witness after witness, each one adding a small detail that seemed to support the case against her. One of the key witnesses was the bank manager, Mr. Iqbal, who claimed to have seen Amina talking to one of the employees the day of the theft. He described how Amina had acted suspiciously when she entered the bank. Amina was shocked. She had never been near the bank that day. She had been at home, tending to her children and preparing lunch. But the details the witness provided seemed convincing. The entire courtroom was listening intently, and Amina could feel their eyes on her. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she began to feel the weight of the accusation more than ever. Farhan tried his best to counter the prosecution's claims. He pointed out that there was no concrete evidence to link Amina to the crime. He asked questions about the reliability of the witness testimonies. But each time he tried to argue his case, Judge Malik would interrupt him, his tone dismissive. The evidence speaks for itself, the judge would say, and each time, Amina could feel her hopes fading. As the trial continued, the pressure on Amina grew unbearable. She had always been a woman of simple needs. She had never craved attention or recognition. Her world had always revolved around her family and community. Now, her life was under scrutiny, and it felt like everyone around her was judging her. Her neighbors, who once greeted her with warmth, now avoided eye contact. She could see the whispers behind her back, the suspicion in their eyes. It was as though she had already been branded guilty, and there was nothing she could do to change their minds. Each day, as the trial went on, Amina's hope seemed to diminish. The more the prosecution presented, the more she felt trapped. Every argument seemed to confirm her worst fears. What if she couldn't prove her innocence? What if she was going to be convicted for a crime she didn't commit? The idea of being separated from her children, of losing everything she had worked so hard for, filled her with dread. The courtroom was often filled with silence, broken only by the sound of the judge's gavel. Amina's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out of the situation. She knew she was innocent, but how could she prove it? She had no alibi, no one who could testify that she hadn't been at the scene of the crime. All she had was her word, and the judge, who seemed to have made up his mind, wasn't listening to her. One day, as the trial dragged on, Amina found herself alone in the courtroom during a short break. She stepped outside to catch her breath, but as she walked down the hallway, she overheard a conversation between two members of the prosecution team. They were discussing how they had managed to gather enough evidence to secure Amina's conviction. "She's done for," one of them said. "There's no way she's getting out of this." Amina froze. Her heart sank as she realized just how far the prosecution had gone to build their case against her. They had been planning this all along. This wasn't about justice. It was about winning at any cost. Her stomach churned as she thought of everything she stood to lose. The whispers of guilt, the rumors that had already spread through the town, all of it seemed to be working against her. Her mind was racing, and her chest felt tight with anxiety. Amina knew she had to do something. But what? How could she fight back against such powerful forces? Farhan, her lawyer, was doing his best, but it wasn't enough. Judge Malik seemed to have his mind made up. The evidence, though circumstantial, was all pointing in one direction. Amina felt like she was sinking in quicksand, and no matter how hard she tried to fight, she couldn't escape. That night, as she lay in her bed, Amina stared at the ceiling, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She couldn't sleep. The trial was taking a toll on her body and soul. She kept thinking about her family, about her children. What would happen to them if she was convicted? They didn't deserve this. They didn't deserve to be dragged through this mess because of something she hadn't done. She reached for her phone and dialed the number she had been avoiding for days. Her husband, Zaid, was a Supreme Court justice. He had always been her rock, the one person she could rely on in times of trouble. But Amina hesitated. She didn't want to burden him with her problems. He was busy with his own responsibilities, and she didn't want to seem weak or helpless. But as she looked at the phone in her hand, she knew she had no choice. Amina had always tried to solve her problems on her own. She had never been one to ask for help. But this was different. This wasn't something she could fix on her own. She needed Zaid. She needed him to help her, to guide her through this mess. So, with a deep breath, she pressed the dial button. When Zaid answered, his voice was calm, but Amina could hear the concern in his tone. "Amina? What's wrong?" Tears welled up in Amina's eyes as she finally let go of the weight that had been pressing on her chest for days. She explained the entire situation to him, every detail of the trial, every moment of fear and frustration. She told him about the prosecutor's tactics, about Judge Malik's cold treatment, and about the feeling of hopelessness that had taken over her. Zaid listened intently, his silence allowing Amina to vent her emotions. Finally, when she finished, he spoke. "I'll handle this," he said, his voice firm and reassuring. "You're not alone. I'm coming to help." Amina felt a sense of relief wash over her. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to believe that there was a chance, maybe even a strong one, that she could get through this. She wasn't alone. Zaid would help her. But what would happen next? Could he truly bring justice where it had been lost? Amina wasn't sure, but for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to have hope. As the trial began, Amina's heart sank. The courtroom was cold and intimidating. The judge sat at the front, his face stern as he called the proceedings to order. Amina was seated at the defendant's table, her lawyer, a young man named Farhan, sitting beside her. Farhan seemed nervous, constantly adjusting his glasses and fumbling with his papers. He was new to the legal profession, and Amina could sense his lack of experience. She tried to focus on what was happening, but the room felt so overwhelming. Judge Malik wasted no time in getting to the point. The defendant, Amina Khan, is accused of stealing a large sum of money from the local bank, he said, his voice cold and authoritative. Amina's heart raced in her chest. How could this be happening? She had never set foot in the bank that day. She had been at home, taking care of her children. But the evidence seemed to paint a different picture. The prosecution had presented a series of circumstantial details that made Amina look guilty. They had pointed out her connection to the bank's manager, whom she knew from a few community events. They had even presented a blurry security camera footage that showed a woman in a similar dress to the one Amina had worn that day. It was far from conclusive, but it was enough to cast doubt on her innocence. Amina's defense lawyer tried his best to argue that the evidence was not solid enough to convict her. He pointed out the flaws in the security footage and questioned the reliability of the witnesses. But his arguments seemed weak compared to the confident, well-prepared prosecution. Judge Malik barely seemed to listen. Every time Amina's lawyer made a point, the judge quickly dismissed it, looking at him with a disapproving frown. Throughout the trial, Amina felt more and more like a pawn in a game she didn't understand. The judge's attitude toward her seemed to grow colder with every passing moment. His gaze, when it landed on her, was filled with suspicion. She couldn't shake the feeling that he had already made up his mind about her guilt. There was something about the way he looked at her that made her uneasy. She had heard rumors about Judge Malik that he held grudges against certain people in the town. She had heard that he could be vindictive. Was this why he was treating her this way? Was there something personal behind this case? The tension in the courtroom was unbearable. Amina felt trapped, her every word scrutinized, her every movement watched. She had never been in a situation like this before. She had always been law-abiding, always tried to do the right thing. Yet here she was, accused of something she hadn't done, fighting for her freedom. The stress was taking its toll. Her hands shook, her mouth felt dry, and the weight of the situation seemed to press down on her chest. The media had caught wind of the case as well. Local newspapers ran stories about the town's most shocking crime. The headline read, "Well-known local woman arrested for bank theft." It felt like everyone in the town was turning against her. Amina couldn't even go out for groceries without someone whispering behind her back. Her friends avoided her, unsure of what to believe. Her reputation, built over years of quiet service to her family and community, was suddenly shattered. Her neighbors, who had once greeted her with smiles, now looked at her with suspicion. Amina felt the weight of their judgment on her shoulders, and she wondered how she could ever face them again. Days turned into weeks as the trial continued. Amina's life was slowly unraveling. She spent sleepless nights, trying to think of any way she could prove her innocence. She thought about the people who would vouch for her, her neighbors, her friends, but the evidence against her seemed insurmountable. She was living in a nightmare, one that seemed to have no end. And with Judge Malik leading the trial, it felt like the odds were stacked against her. In moments of quiet desperation, Amina would find herself alone, staring out of her window. She thought of her husband, Zaid. He was a man of honor, respected by many in the legal world. But he was far away, caught up in his own responsibilities. She knew he would never believe she was guilty, but he couldn't be there to help her. She couldn't bring herself to call him. What would he think? Would he be disappointed? Would he even be able to help in a case like this? But as the trial wore on, Amina knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed help, someone who could see the truth and stand up for her when no one else would. She needed someone with power, someone who could break through the walls of injustice that surrounded her. Little did she know, her husband, Zaid, was the key to her salvation. But for now, Amina was left to face this battle alone, praying for a miracle that would bring the truth to light.